A family tree grows out of its stories. Our stories are the rich, fertile soil in which our lives take root. Our stories shape our common identity and unify us as a community. A family tree grows out of its stories, and our story starts in the beginning. When God created the heavens and the earth, there was nothing. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light, and the light was good. God created morning and sunset and nighttime. And God made a great dome, and he called it sky, and he put it in the middle of the chaos. Then God pushed all the water into one spot and scooped all the dirt together to make earth, and it was good. And God planted stuff on top of the earth, mossy stuff, leafy stuff, stuff that dug down into the dirt and grew up toward the sun, and it was good. And then God really got down to business. He made swarms of swimming things who lived in the water, globby ones made of jelly, and little flippy ones who clustered together, and big ones who swam alone. Oh, and giants. God made giants. God made flying things who lived in the air, some fragile and fluttery, some who soared high above the earth. And God made runners to thunder across the land and chase things. And then God made us and told us to stick together no matter what, and to just stay in the garden where our every need would be met. But we wanted more, and in our desire, we fell. And yet our fall set us free, and our stories truly began. And from the fertile soil of our stories, our family tree takes root. And again, we are reminded of exactly who we are.
This is a story called The Bow in the Clouds. She could hardly believe what she had just heard him say. This changes everything, she thought. This means nothing is the same. This means everything I thought I knew is different now. Noah's wife could hardly believe her ears as he told her how this story, their story, was going to end. She thought she knew. She thought she knew what the ending was going to look like. They had built an ark, they had loaded that ark, and they had floated on the floodwaters and stayed safe for 40 days and for 40 nights. And now the rain has stopped and the earth has dried up, and she thought that that was going to be the end of the story. But her husband had just told her something completely different, completely new, and it changed everything. She could not believe it. As she listened to what he was telling her, and as she began to process it, she started to remember when she was a little girl and her father would teach her brothers how to shoot a bow and arrow. That the pulling back of the bow was just as important as the release and vice versa. That your target is what you aim for, and that the goal of the bow and arrow is indeed destruction. She would watch as a little girl out the window these lessons from her father to her brothers. And she grew up to have her own husband and her own family, and she had seen Noah teach her own sons that the bow and how you pulled it back was just as important as how you released it, and that the ultimate goal was your target and death and destruction of that target. And she and her family were good and faithful followers of God. As Noah was telling her, what he was telling her that day. All she could think about was the times with other good and faithful followers of God that they had gathered together and sung praises to the God who had a bow and arrow aimed at humanity, ready to get their attention, ready to wake them up from complacency. And they praised that God because they loved that God, and they followed that God because they knew that that God loved them enough to do things that got their attention when God needed to wake them up. She knew what a bow and arrow was for. And hadn't she already gone through enough? She had followed her husband and was faithful to him and was faithful to God, even through everyone in the neighborhood jeering and glaring at them as their entire front yard was taken over by the building of an ark. He's heard the voice of God, the neighbor said. What God is he listening to? And she'd been faithful and she'd followed him, even onto an ark with so many animals that they indeed had lost count a couple times, for 40 days and for 40 nights, seasick and wondering when the rain would stop. And that is how the story was supposed to end. She decided already that was the end of the story. Nothing else could happen. Nothing else could change. This needed to be wrapped up in a little box with a pretty little bow and done. She was done. Enough. And yet her husband had just delivered the news to her that he has heard God's voice again. Again, I heard God's voice, and God told me that God is going to set the bow down. God is going to set the bow in the clouds as a reminder to us that there is a covenant between God and the whole world, all of humanity. The bow, he says, you wouldn't believe it, the bow is no longer aimed at us. God doesn't need to get our attention by violence and destruction anymore. Instead, the bow is aimed away, and God is getting our attention now by peace and love that never ends. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. God's voice again. The bow set in the clouds, not held by God anymore, but set down. A sign of peace. She needed peace. So she dug down the deepest she had dug since this whole story started. Since that day her husband had come to her and said, I heard God's voice for the first time. Since that very moment, she dug the deepest she ever had for the last little bit of faith she had, for the last little bit of courage she had, and she stepped off of the ark on to dry land. And she felt a sense of peace. And she looked in the sky and saw the bow in the clouds. And she thought to herself, I've understood God to be one way. And that's been wonderful for my life and for my story and for my family. I feel close to God. I know that God is with us, and I've understood God this way. But imagine now how my children are going to experience God, and how my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren and generations from me after me will know God to be a God of peace, a God of never-ending love, a God of grace, a God of promise. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. And as she studied the bow in the clouds, it was as if the absence of rain was making the sky come alive with color. God is faithful. God's love never ends. And even though there might be times when destruction comes, when tragedy happens, this story reminds us that God is with us in the midst of it all. That God does not cause those things, but instead, God is with us in the midst of those things. And for that, we say, thanks be to God.